3 were given to the Elves, immortal, wisest, and fairest of all beings.
Hello, I'm Nicholas John.
And I am Nick Andrew.
And we come to you live from the Green Dragon. In this episode of our Prologue series, we continue our look at the peoples of Middle-earth. This time we're going to talk about the Elves and Wizards.
Elves and Wizards. Whew, that's a lot. I'm excited.
Yeah, they both lived for quite a while, so how much are we going to talk about?
Well, I think one thing that's important to point out right out of the gate is elves have been around so long. They have such an extensive past that for what we're doing, we may not want to delve too far in the past, and that's kind of things we might look at later. But I think I'd like to focus on where they are now, and now being during the narrative that we're going to be talking through, with a little bit of history to help set the stage.
Yeah, I think that's fair. There's so much. There are books about their history, so let's just focus our attention to what we need to know about the Lord of the Rings.
And really, I mean, one of the things that comes to mind immediately is how Tolkien, when he wrote the Hobbit, and when he wrote the Lord of the Rings, and the what became the Silmarillion, he totally flipped the paradigm on what elves had been in literature up to that point in our history. So, maybe tell us a little bit about what elves would have looked like normally had Tolkien not come around.
What did they look like?
They were like little gnomish things, like pixies.
Oh,
like
yeah.
think like Irish fairies. Like that's akin to elves. Little mischievous. Like now we might use the word imp or sprite.
So where, I mean, do house elves from Harry Potter, do they kind of fit into this diminutive form?
Yes, really, and that's actually a really good point, because for Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling did a good job of drawing from literary past for and folklore to build the world that she did. And I think that's actually an excellent comparison.
It's interesting that we have like these two modern novels or stories, and the elf type, the race of elves, are so different. One is, as we said, Rowling's is kind of the traditional view, and then Tolkien's elves are a new vision of what elves can be. That has sort of taken off in the fantasy world, that becomes the standard.
Right, like nowadays I would say a race of elves, and most I would wager would picture tall, proud, one with the forest, elegant. And that's an image of quote unquote elf. And I think it's worth noting at this point that the word elves and the word elven with a V, those words were first coined by Tolkien when he wrote about the elves.
Right. He deliberately changed from the spelling ELF and ELFEN.
Exactly. So, but I mean, we talk about elves now, and the stereotype that we have in our time is that was brought by Tolkien.
That's the same kind of elf that would be in like Warcraft and really any
Elder Scrolls,
any kind of
Dungeons and Dragons, Dragon Age.
All of those.
So the Legend of Zelda.
Yes.
That whole image of an elf was totally flipped by Tolkien. So I think that's cool. We owe a lot to that one daring choice to change. Well, and I think one of the first things that you'd notice, like comparing Tolkien elf to any other kind of elf, is they were tall.
Yes.
They were very tall. For those of you in the Imperial system, we're talking like record height of 9 feet tall.
9 feet?
9 feet tall.
Whoa.
Yeah. Average, I would say, maybe between 6 and 7.5 feet tall.
Okay, so I'm right around 6 foot, 6'1", something like that. I'd be a short elf.
Right, you would. Even for a woman, you would be a short elf.
Whoa, man. So in the movies, it's hard to actually picture that because they used people, but they didn't extend their height.
Right. Well, and I would say they probably purposely went for actors that were taller.
Okay.
Like they had a specific look they wanted to go for, very fair. That's actually a good descriptor. Elves are constantly referred to as very fair.
Yeah.
In appearance.
Yeah. Okay.
So, but very,
Interesting.
very tall, very tall. What are some other like big physical characteristics maybe that we could point out?
Well, one thing that it almost feels like burying the lead is that elves are immortal. They can't die. They can't get sick. They can't die of natural causes, I should say. They could be killed by violence, which is why wars are a big deal. When they talk about wars and they talk about the songs of sorrow, because they live so long, they remember these things. Some of those people were there the day that their friends and families and kinsmen died, and they have, long, deep knowledge. They don't forget that easily.
Well, I mean, we're talking thousands of years over the course of the ages of Middle Earth.
Mm-hmm.
That's a long time. I mean, those of you that know the character Legolas, 2,000 years old? Good approximation?
Yep.
And he's young?
Yeah. And he's a young, spry elf off on an adventure. It's true. Yeah, he's considered a young elf, and he is at least 2,000 years old when the story starts. Which means that even though Orlando Bloom was, 18 when he took on the role?
Yep.
Obviously it's silly to think of him back in the time when Bilbo was in Thingol's care, sort of.
Thranduil?
When Bilbo was sneaking around in Thingol's kingdom, and
Thranduil.
And Legolas was probably there. So like the idea in the Hobbit movies of this whole retconning Legolas into it, he just wasn't mentioned. He was probably on location.
Yeah, logically one would assume that Thranduil's son would be there.
Right.
So.
Yep. So I mean that's a departure from our story, but
I had no problem with his presence in the Hobbit films.
No. It makes sense for those who know that he's not 18 years old.
Right. So, but they can be killed by violence. And then one other thing, and this is big, like imagine this for a second. They can die of grief. Like losing the will to live or dying of a broken heart. They can just lose the will to hang on to their life and drift.
Isn't that her fate?
Well, I mean, she becomes mortal. She after Aragorn dies, King Elisar dies, she ends up going back to Lothlorien and kind of wanders around and then fades into memory.
So okay, that's a very specific point. Because of her family history, is that true? Am I going down the right path, or is that anybody?
Yep, it was. Oh crap! What were their names?
It's because of her family history. Her father is Elrond the Half-Elven in the histories, and we can go into this another time. There were two brothers that were given a choice. And the choice was to remain immortal, or become mortal.
It was Erendil and Elwing's children, Elrond and Elros, the brothers, that got the choice. Those two.
So Elrond, his brother Elros, had the choice, and Elrond chose to remain immortal, and his brother chose mortality. And there's a whole story, there's a whole reason for that. But because of that choice is on Elrond, it's on Arwen, his daughter, as well. And she chooses mortality and a life with her husband in that sense. But mortality for elves still is very long-lived.
Right. And it's logically one would assume she lived on a full lifespan after making that choice.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
So, because in the appendices, it makes it a point to kind of really draw attention to how the sacrifice she was making by choosing mortality, because she would be alone afterwards. If you've seen the films, there's the scene where Elrond tells Arwen that there's nothing for you here, and we see these little flash forwards of Arwen in funeral attire, dark colors, weeping at a tomb, and there's ever the sign of the forlorn feeling. There's like dried leaves blowing through, and it looks like we're in the autumn leading into winter. I mean, that's kind of the movies calling attention to that whole concept that we get in the appendices, that she's making a huge sacrifice because she's going to be alone for a long time after Aragorn dies. And the whole other line, because we've got Elrond, his daughter Arwen, her twin brothers Elladan and Elrohir. So we've got them. The other side, Elros, we'll talk about them. Stay tuned. They're coming soon.
That grief is actually a decent segue, because the elves are so deeply connected to the life of Middle-earth itself. Like in the movies, they live in the woods, but all of their buildings incorporate the nature around them. The trees become part of the support structure or that kind of thing. And they have this sort of idyllic look, the way they're portrayed. It's almost like they've come to a perfection. They've had enough time to figure that out.
Right, how to construct without impeding the natural order of the land around them.
Mm-hmm. But the state of the world, in terms of elves, is that it is not their time any longer. And it's the time of men that's coming up. And we'll talk about the men next time. But the point is that in The Lord of the Rings, the elves are in decline.
Yes.
They are starting to leave Middle-earth for the Undying Lands. And that is kind of a theme whenever we meet the elves, is like, do we get involved? Do we not get involved? We're kind of thinking about getting out of here. What point do we have in potentially dying when we could just get out of here?
Right. Well, and you bring up a really good point, because one of the only ways that they can actually die, lose their lives, is through violence, through being killed physically. And if they're a waning culture, they're done. And you bring up an extremely good point. What incentive do they have to fight for it when they can just hop on a boat and sail off into happy funland?
Mm-hmm. Now, the things that Middle-earth would lose if they do leave, or when they do leave, depending on your part of the timeline, is everything that they bring, everything that they're known for, which one of the big things is the way they keep lore, they keep the history, they remember these things. So people like Gandalf, who are trying to put together the puzzle of what is this ring and what is happening and who's kind of pulling the strings, the elves become invaluable because they can say either firsthand or there are writings of firsthand accounts that hold this knowledge. And the other thing that they make are songs. So when Frodo is in Rivendell, he listens to the music of the elves as they speak. When they're in Lothlorien, they hear the elves singing and grieving through song. Yes. When in the movie, really early on, it seems, Frodo and his friends are just starting their journey, and they come across the elves, and they see them go by, and they're glowing in white, and they're singing, and they sound sad because it's not their time any longer.
And if I'm remembering correctly, when Howard Shore composed that little song for the films, it was using actual elven lyrics, and it's them mourning losing the stars. Because the stars are above Middle-earth. They won't.
And a quick delve into the history is when the elves woke up for the very first time, there was no sun, there was no moon, there were only the stars.
Yes.
So that's why they have a very particular love for the stars.
Can you imagine that? Just waking up in a world where there's no smog, there's no exhaust, we don't even know if there's an atmosphere. There's no anything to impede the light of the stars. If you've ever been to a mountain, like near where there's no city nearby, and you kill all the lights and the stars, they're overwhelming. It is so gorgeous. Can you imagine opening your eyes and that being the first thing you ever see in your life? Oh.
Well, no, I can't. But
I can't either. It'd be so beautiful. So beautiful.
So, what is the thing that the elves did that causes them to be integral to the story?
So the elves were great craftsmen. they could make any... I mean, okay, look at the art out there. Read the descriptions. The elves can craft like you wouldn't believe. With lifespans in the thousands of years, you better believe they're good. So, somewhere along in the story, our bad guy, in disguise, is envious of this crafting skill that the elves have. And at this point in history, one elf in particular, whose name was Celebrimbor. And our villain kind of takes on a fair form. There's that word again, fair. And for lack of a better term, he kind of seduces the elves of this area into this... What's the word I'm looking for? They couldn't tell what he really was. And he... Go ahead.
Is the fair form... does that hint that maybe he looks like an elf specifically, or is that just like he puts on a beautiful face?
Well, the person we're talking about in specific, Sauron, is known in the previous periods in history. He's specifically referenced as being an exceptional shapeshifter. He's a sorcerer, arguably the first sorcerer, and he's mastered shapeshifting. And I mean, someday I hope we get a chance to talk about those stories, because, imagination running wild. But so really, I mean, we can take it literally that he really did take on a fair form, but also that he presented a false front, as it were, fair face. And the name he took, Anatar, actually means Lord of Gifts. So he probably was very persuasive, not only in word but in action. So, but he convinced Celebrimbor to work with him. There's things I can teach you, there's things you can teach me, and they began to craft together. And Anatar, aka Sauron, actually had quite a pivotal role in that period of history, and that civilization that actually straddled the Misty Mountains, either end of Khazad-Dûm, aka Moria, and elves and dwarves living together. Well, you heard it here first.
So this is the time that Khazad-Dûm existed already?
Right. This Khazad-Dûm...
Okay, so this is the time when the highway through the mountain was already established.
Right.
Which is really old.
It's exceptionally old. Unless I'm completely mistaken, Khazad-Dûm existed before this area of Middle-earth became the focus. Khazad-Dûm was already there.
Whoa.
So dwarves, unmentioned in the First Age, delved and built Khazad-Dûm. And obviously during this joint civilization between elves and dwarves around... I cannot remember the name of the city for the life of me. But it was basically Elven City on one end, Khazad-Dûm, Elven City on the other end, and it was one big civilization. Now we have this beautiful civilization of elves and dwarves together. And then the dwarves delve too deep. And devastation. Lots of devastation. It's crazy.
So let's talk about where is home and who lives where.
So we mentioned Arwen, and we mentioned Elrond, and we mentioned Elrond's twin sons, which are not seen in the films, but they are in the books. So we've got Elrond, Arwen, Elladan, and Elrohir. They live in Rivendell, which, if you're looking at the map, Misty Mountains are like roughly down the middle of Middle-earth. Maybe go 3/4 of the way up and west of the Misty Mountains, and you're going to see a little valley called Rivendell. Imladris. And that is where Elrond, Arwen, and then Elrond's twin sons live. And it's where our company stops for quite some time.
Referred to as the last homely house.
Yes. When we're in Rivendell, there's a little shindig that I like to refer to as the Council of Elrond.
I've heard of it.
Legolas is one of the prominent figures that is representing the people of Middle-earth, the free folk, as they say, at this council. Legolas actually comes from over the Misty Mountains, northern Mirkwood, and the term we're given, or the name we're given for this kingdom, is the Woodland Realm. So in The Hobbit, we hear about the Elf King. The Elf King's name is Thranduil, we find out later, and Legolas is Thranduil's son. So Legolas is the prince of Mirkwood, or the prince of the Woodland Realm. So he represents that group of elves at this council. But then you go a little further south and west of Mirkwood, and you get Lothlorien, which houses who?
Just to be specific, Lorien is the forest which straddles the river Nimrodel before it enters into Anduin the Great. And Lothlorien is or am I wrong?
Well, Lorien and Lothlorien are both names for the forest. The city is Caras Galadon.
And that is where Galadriel and Celeborn are, and that is where we meet Haldir, who brings them into the city to Galadriel. And Galadriel, just a fun note, is older than the moon. She is Arwen's grandmother on her mother's side.
I think she's more beautiful than Arwen, just say it.
Okay. You're allowed to have that opinion.
Okay.
And Lothlorien is noted for its sort of like step out of timiness,
right?
If that can be explained. And in particular seasons, it has the leaves turn gold, but they do not fall. So the whole forest looks like it's been turned to gold. Hence the name Lothlorien, which is the golden wood, and it is held in its stasis by the power of Galadriel and the elves there.
Well, and even more specifically, the ring that she holds.
Right, and she's been able to wear that ring because the Great Ring has been lost.
Right.
And now that we're in the story in Lord of the Rings, the fact that the ring is found throws her power into challenge, and she is aware of this, that if Frodo fails and the ring is recovered, then there's no chance for elves and probably the rest of the world as well.
Right? There really wouldn't be. So the quest is on the edge of a knife. Stray but a little, and it will fail. So, and that's, like you said, Lothlorien is a step out of time. In the book, Tolkien does a beautiful job of describing how that makes Frodo feel, how that makes certain different characters feel. So when we get there, really pay attention to it, because it's almost as if they've lost so much track of time that they almost don't care anymore. That's intense. I don't even know what that would feel like. I don't know. Another fun fact about Lothlorien is there are Malorn trees there. It's the only place in Middle-earth that Malorn trees are found at this point in history. So, we need descriptors for this. Like, how big is a Malorn tree? You know, like a redwood, the great redwoods in California. Malorn is, like, bigger than that.
Well, the way they're described is that they are unlike anything else, both for their scale, their size, and also there's something else about them that is just unusual to the hobbits and our main characters.
When these trees are so big that there are flats and platforms and bridges and staircases that wind up them. And this is no like treehouse. This is a tree fortress.
Yeah. The whole city extends from the ground up.
It's intense. In trees.
One of the hallmarks of elfin civilization is this connection to nature. Each of these three, for lack of a better word, city-states of elves, the Rivendell, Lorien, and the Woodland Realm, all take place in a particular natural environment. Two of them are forests, one of them is a valley. We don't know if it was a forest or not. But there are trees and waterfalls, and it is lush. And that is a hallmark of elven civilization. And like we said before, their life is tied in with the life of Middle-earth. And everything is shifting at the time of Lord of the Rings. Everything is shifting. For the elves, they're shifting west so to speak, to the Undying Lands, and likewise the men are coming from the east into the space that we know as Middle Earth, which is really just the western end of the continent.
Right. And we don't know much about what's further to the east or the south or the north. Unfortunately, the west we do know about, and that's a story for another time.
Yes, that's for later.
The elves have been around since before the west that was forgotten.
Our other people to talk about are the wizards. And the wizards are a very special brand of being, because they look like men, they act like men, they talk like men, but they are not men. So what are they?
In fact, they're stronger than men. They may appear to be old, but Tolkien actually makes comment at one point that Gandalf was more physically capable than Boromir, which is kind of an ox of a man that comes from Gondor. Yeah, Gandalf, more physically capable than a fully grown man in his prime. That's intense.
Yeah, well, we do see some of that when they are challenged physically. He's the one that seems to be able to stand the longest. He is capable.
Extremely capable. If you've seen the films, you get to enjoy a little bit of that. He's so capable, in fact, that they encounter, to quote Gandalf, a demon of the ancient world at some point during their venture, and Gandalf is able to stand toe-to-toe with this individual while instructing the rest of the Fellowship to fly. As in, flee, get out, get away, run. Even tells them that foe is beyond any of them. So, and I won't say any more about that, because it is a pivotal point in the story. But he's able to stand toe-to-toe with that, and there's a specific reason, and it's what lies behind everything we've said about these wizards. There are only a certain number of them, and they have the capabilities that they do because they are not human. They are of the Maiar.
You're right, they are of the Maiar, which we don't know a ton about. They seem to be immortal, but they could be killed. We know that from the story. But we don't know if their spirit can die, because we also know that strange things can happen in the story. But they are definitely a spiritual being, which means that they're tapped into a whole nother source of power than men and hobbits and elves are.
Well, as a matter of fact, they were sent to Middle-earth with a very specific purpose. This order of wizards, the Istari, was formed by the Valar, the powers in the far west and the Undying Lands, as a response to what had been going on in Middle-earth, and as a reaction to Sauron and the One Ring. And they formed this group, the 5 wizards, with a specific task of rallying Middle-earth against it, to do whatever they could do within their capabilities to counter Sauron and to challenge and to undo, perhaps. So, and each of them arguably took a different path, and the 5 we know of, we have the leader of the wizards, the head of the order, Saruman the White. Then we have Gandalf the Grey. We have Radagast the Brown. And then we have 2 wizards who we know are cloaked in blue, but their names were forgotten, and they went to the east and were never heard from again. I have theories. That's for another time.
Right, yep. There is a theory about what the blue wizards were up to. We'll save that for another time when we talk about what happens elsewhere in the world. We really want to stay focused on what's happening in Lord of the Rings, which means that we focus primarily on Gandalf and Saruman.
Yep.
And secondarily on Radagast.
Yes. So, and I mentioned before that each one of them kind of assumed their role or took on their duty differently.
Radagast sort of comes off as the nature wizard. He is very specifically typecasted, so to speak, in the Hobbit movies. When we see him, he sort of comes off in the movies as this bumbling, sort of easily tricked kind of guy. The reason he comes off that way is because in Lord of the Rings, Saruman refers to him as sort of an easy to trick sort of fool of a wizard. He disregards his power, which Gandalf, being a little bit more accepting of others, does not disregard his power out of hand. But he is friends with birds, and he talks to like the creatures, and we don't know if he talks to them like they can speak a language, but he does have an affinity with creatures and spends most of his time out in the nature of the world.
Right, and I think it even at one point specifies he prefers the company of animals because he thinks they're oh, what does he say? He compares them to people and chooses animals over people. So I can't remember his exact words. I wish I could. But I mean, pardon the pun, this guy's got a deep-rooted love of the land and everything in it, the creatures that populate it. And that's kind of the approach Radagast takes. One could argue he seems to have forgotten that his mission is to oppose Sauron and rally Middle-earth. I like to think, what's wrong with rallying Middle-earth itself?
Right. You could also argue that each of the three main wizards that we're going to deal with take on a different portion of existence. Radagast covers the natural world. Mm-hmm. Saruman takes over the mechanical, technological part of the world, and Gandalf, who is held up as holding true to the mission, deals with the people.
Right. Exceptionally so.
So if you want to look at it in terms of interpretation of the mission, that might be one way to look at it. But we know that Radagast isn't enough interested in the mission to be a big part of it. And we know that Saruman has ulterior motives that get in the way of the mission.
Right. So, well, and let's just dive right into it with Saruman then, I suppose.
Okay.
So, traditionally, wizards are wanderers. Saruman is really the only one of the three wizards that stayed in Middle-earth that establishes kind of a fortress, a home of his own, the Tower of Orthanc, which sits in the Ring of Isengard, and it was built by the Númenóreans, and he fashions that as his seat of power.
Right.
And it's there that he starts to really dive into, like you mentioned before, the mechanical aspect of things, fabrication, machinery, kind of really an industrial approach to doing things. So, and we do see a little bit of that.
To get an idea of where Isengard is, if you follow south from Rivendell to the bottom of the mountains, there's a gap called the Gap of Rohan between the mountain ranges, and nestled up inside the northern edge of that gap is Isengard.
Right. Well, and it's also important to note that Fangorn Forest, which is probably the oldest forest that we encounter in the narrative, Fangorn Forest is right up against Isengard.
And without getting into too many of the details of the story, Saruman's interest in technology sort of manifests in an interest in overcoming or taking power.
One could almost use the analogy, he decides he wants to try fighting fire with fire.
Ooh, interesting. Okay. That's fair.
The movies portray it all one way, and the books portray it, I think, in a completely different way.
Ooh, we'll come back to that.
We will come back to that.
All right, so
That
Gandalf then.
Gandalf personified the idea that the wizards had no home traditionally and were wanderers. As a matter of fact, Gandalf's most prominent alias or nickname, Mithrandir, given by the elves, means grey wanderer or grey pilgrim. And he constantly wandered. He was accused of being a busybody, a stormcrow, someone who, when he shows up at the door, only brings bad news, likes to get into everyone's business, never settled, known for traveling around in a cart with a horse, with his pointed hat and his blue scarf. Later, we come to find out that he's renowned for his fireworks. Gandalf was a bit of a pyro. That has meaning later once you know something about Gandalf, but I can't tell you that now. Gandalf is a bit of a pyro. You see it in The Hobbit, you see it in Lord of the Rings. One of my favorite scenes from The Hobbit, though, is when he's lighting pine cones on fire, and the Dwarven company is lobbing these flaming pine cones at their enemies. The image there, to me, is just remarkable. So, yes, Gandalf was a bit of a pyro, and that's one of the things he's known for in the Shire, and we find out he's kind of a frequent visitor to the Shire. That's where he meets Bilbo. That's where he meets Frodo. He spends a lot of time there, to the point that Saruman actually holds it against him that he spends so much time with the halflings. So, and I think it's also worth pointing out that Gandalf, when the Order of the Wizards was first being decided, Gandalf did not want to come. Gandalf was afraid. His name was not Gandalf at that time. He had a different name. He was afraid. Sauron scared him. And he did not want to go. And to a degree, he went against his will. And fortunately for us, he ends up being instrumental in the narrative and kind of the overall goal of the Fellowship and the Company and Middle-earth, the Free Folk. But he did not want to go. He did not want to go.
Is it true that Gandalf and the other wizards are on the same spiritual hierarchy as Sauron?
They are all of the Maiar. Sauron is one of the Maiar. Arguably, Sauron could be declared as the most powerful of the Maiar. But they are.
But they're of the same order.
Right. It's also worth noting the Balrog is of that order as well. To a degree, we're watching brother against brother.
Yeah, interesting.
Right. Ooh, I do want to point out that when the wizards were brought to Middle-earth, they were given little to no memory of their previous existence in Arda as Maiar. That was taken away. So, little to no memory, which I think is cool.
Yeah. So something that I think is interesting is that the wizards, the Starry, have not been around forever. They've not been, mixing among with the elves from before time. Instead, they actually come pretty late in the story. They come about 1,000 years into the Third Age, which is still close to 2,000 years before the War of the Ring, before Lord of the Rings, the story. So they've been around for quite a long time, but they are not as ancient on the earth as the elves.
Right. Well, and most importantly, not as ancient in their current form.
Right.
So, and like I just mentioned, as they're aware, they're not necessarily fully aware of what they had been before.
Right.
That was one of the bargains of agreeing to take on this task.
Interesting. So they come down with one purpose, 5 of them that we know about. 2 of them go off without a word. We don't know anything about them. One of them sticks to nature. One of them turns his mind to try to bend the situation to his own will. And the one who is afraid, holds true.
Yes. He becomes, I'm going to use the word. He makes his mission kindling the fires of passion in the peoples of Middle-earth. Oh yes. Pyro. Actually, during the story, there are certain moments where Gandalf is speaking with someone, and Tolkien uses flame-like verbiage to describe what's happening.
So that does it for our introduction to elves and wizards. Obviously, there is a lot more happening behind the scenes, but this should give us a good starting point for who these types of characters are when we meet them in the story. So with that, I say thank you for joining us for episode 0.3 of the Green Dragon Live.
There is so much more to come. I invite you to go to our website, greendragonlive.com, where you can find out all about our show.
You can also subscribe to our newsletter, where you get show notes and everything else.
Also, don't forget to follow us on Twitter at greendragonlive, and shoot us your questions and comments there using the hashtag GDLive.
Or visit our page on Facebook at facebook.com/greendragonlive.
I also want to give a shout out to Harry Morell for our beautiful intro and outro music. You can find more of his work at youtube.com/Harry Morell. That's Morell, 2 R's, 2 L's.
Thanks again for listening. I'm Nicholas John.
And I'm Nick Andrew.
Join us next time when we are live from the Green Dragon.
And remember, the road goes ever on and on.
And if you don't keep your feet, there's no knowing where you might get swept off to.